June 7, 1944. 24 hours after the largest amphibious invasion in history, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in his headquarters at Southwick House, reading casualty reports from Normandy. The numbers were worse than anyone had publicly admitted. Omaha Beach had been a slaughterhouse. Nearly 2,400 American casualties in a single morning. Entire companies wiped out before reaching the seawall. The follow-up waves had to navigate through bodies floating in the surf. At Utah Beach, the situation was better but still costly. The British and Canadian sectors at Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches had their own problems. The critical road junction that was supposed to fall on D-Day, was still in German hands. It would stay that way for weeks. Eisenhower's staff presented him with the stark reality. Allied forces controlled a series of disconnected beachheads, none deeper than 6 miles inland. German panzer divisions were moving toward Normandy. Weather forecasts predicted storms that would make resupply nearly impossible. And Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man who had humiliated the Allies in North Africa, was organizing a counterattack. Some of Eisenhower's own commanders were quietly suggesting the unthinkable. If German forces launched a coordinated counteroffensive in the next 48 hours, Allied forces might be driven back into the sea. Perhaps they should consider a fighting withdrawal. Evacuate as many men as possible. Regroup in England. Try again in a few months with better weather and more preparation. Eisenhower listened to these assessments without speaking. Then he made the decision that would determine whether Western civilization survived the 20th century. He would hold Normandy. No withdrawal. No evacuation plans. No contingencies for failure. Allied forces would expand the beachhead or die trying. The decision seemed insane to some of his staff, but Eisenhower understood something his subordinates didn't. This wasn't just a military calculation. It was a test of Allied resolve that would echo through history. If you're finding this deep dive into military history compelling, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're uncovering the moments that changed everything. The decisions made under impossible pressure that shaped our world. Don't miss the next one. To understand why Eisenhower's decision was so controversial, you have to understand what the Allies were facing in those first 48 hours after D-Day. The invasion plan had assumed that Allied forces would be 15 to 20 miles inland by June 7th. They weren't. The plan assumed it would fall on D-Day, opening the road network for British armor to sweep into the French interior. It didn't. The plan assumed that Allied air superiority would prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy quickly. It hadn't. German forces were moving faster than Allied intelligence predicted. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth was already engaging Canadian forces near Cannes. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's best-equipped formations, was heading toward the invasion beaches. The 21st Panzer Division had counterattacked on D-Day itself, nearly reaching the beach it soared. Allied naval gunfire had stopped that counterattack, but it revealed a frightening truth. German forces were close enough to the beaches to launch immediate counteroffensives. If multiple panzer divisions hit the Allied beachhead simultaneously, the invasion could collapse. Weather was the second crisis. The meteorologists who had given Eisenhower the green light for June 6th were now warning that a major storm was developing. It would hit Normandy around June 19th. Until then, the English Channel would be rough. Resupply would be difficult. The artificial harbors the Allies were building, the Mulberry Harbors, wouldn't be operational for days. That meant Allied forces in Normandy would be fighting with whatever ammunition and fuel they had landed with. If they ran low before resupply arrived, German counterattacks could succeed simply because Allied guns went silent. The casualty figures were the third problem. Omaha Beach had been far worse than planners expected. The 29th Infantry Division and the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had suffered devastating losses. Some companies landed with 200 men and had 30 effectives by noon. Officers were dead. NCOs were dead. Unit cohesion was shattered. These weren't just numbers. These were the assault troops who were supposed to expand the beachhead. They were supposed to push inland aggressively. Instead, they were reorganizing, evacuating wounded, and trying to figure out who was still alive to give orders. British forces at Gold Beach and Canadian forces at Juno had taken significant casualties breaking through beach defenses. They had pushed inland, but they were exhausted. German resistance was stiffening. The advance was slowing. Eisenhower's intelligence officers presented him with German assessments captured from radio intercepts. German commanders believed the Allies were vulnerable. They were preparing a major counteroffensive. If it succeeded in the next 72 hours, while Allied forces were still disorganized and before reinforcements could arrive in strength, the invasion could be defeated. Some of Eisenhower's subordinates argued this was the moment to be realistic. The invasion had succeeded in landing forces, but it hadn't achieved its objectives. Maybe the smart move was to consolidate what they had, even if that meant pulling back to more defensible positions closer to the beaches. Maybe they should focus on not losing rather than trying to win. Eisenhower rejected that thinking immediately. He understood something fundamental about this moment in history that others were missing. This invasion wasn't a military operation that could be attempted again if it failed. It was a political statement to the world about Allied resolve. If Allied forces withdrew from Normandy, even tactically, even temporarily, the psychological damage would be catastrophic. Stalin would see it as proof that the Western Allies couldn't sustain a second front. He would doubt every promise Churchill and Roosevelt made about commitment to defeating Germany. Soviet trust, already fragile, would shatter. The French resistance would see it as abandonment. Thousands of French civilians were helping Allied forces, feeding them information, sabotaging German communications. If Allied forces withdrew, those civilians would face Nazi reprisals. The resistance would collapse. Future French cooperation would be impossible. The Germans would see it as vindication. Hitler had told his generals that the Allies were soft, that they would break under sustained pressure, that one good counteroffensive would send them running back to England. If he was proven right, German morale would soar. The Nazi regime would claim victory even in defeat. The American public would see it as failure. Mothers and fathers who had just received telegrams saying their sons died on Omaha Beach would demand to know why those boys died for nothing. Political support for the war effort would crater. Isolationists would scream that Europe wasn't worth American blood. Eisenhower looked at the casualty reports and the intelligence assessments and the weather forecasts, and he made a calculation that transcended tactical considerations. Failure here meant failure everywhere. The Allies had to hold Normandy not because it was militarily optimal, but because retreating would lose the war even if it saved some soldiers in the short term. He issued clear orders. No discussion of withdrawal. No contingency planning for evacuation. Every commander would focus on one objective: expand the beachhead, attack inland, take ground, make the Germans react to Allied movements instead of the other way around. His staff thought he was gambling everything on a single roll of the dice. They were right, but Eisenhower understood the dice were already thrown the moment Allied forces hit the beaches. There was no taking the bet back now. And if you're appreciating this level of detail, the kind of history they don't teach in school, go ahead and subscribe. We're bringing you the real stories, the human decisions behind the history books. Hit that button so you don't miss what's coming next. June 8, 1944. Eisenhower crossed the English Channel to visit Normandy himself. He needed to see the situation firsthand. He needed his commanders to see him. Headquarters staff tried to talk him out of it. The beachheads were still under German artillery fire. The situation was too dangerous for the Supreme Commander. Eisenhower went anyway. He understood that his physical presence would send a message louder than any order. If the Supreme Commander was willing to risk his life in Normandy, then Normandy was where the war would be won. There would be no withdrawal because the man who could order withdrawal was standing on French soil. Declaring victory was inevitable. He walked through the carnage at Omaha Beach. Bodies were still being recovered. Equipment was scattered across the sand. Soldiers who had survived the landing were exhausted, hollow-eyed, traumatized. These were the men he was ordering to attack inland. Eisenhower didn't give speeches. He didn't talk about glory or duty. He talked to soldiers like a man who understood what he was asking of them. He asked about their units. He asked about their officers. He asked if they had what they needed to do their jobs. The soldiers saw something in Eisenhower that steadied them. He wasn't some rear echelon commander sending them to die while he sat safely in England. He was there. He was calm. He was confident. If he thought they could win, maybe they could. Eisenhower met with his field commanders. General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group, the operational commanders who would have to execute Eisenhower's order to attack. The meeting was tense. Montgomery argued that British forces needed time to reorganize before pushing toward Cannes. Bradley argued that American forces needed reinforcements before expanding the beachhead significantly. Both commanders were essentially arguing for caution. Eisenhower shut down that thinking immediately. He didn't question their tactical judgment. He redirected their strategic focus. The objective wasn't to build up forces for a perfect offensive. The objective was to prevent German forces from building up for a counteroffensive. That meant attacking now, even if attacks weren't perfectly prepared. Montgomery and Bradley left that meeting understanding that Eisenhower wasn't requesting aggressive action. He was demanding it. Commanders who hesitated would be relieved. Commanders who attacked, even if they failed, would be supported. This was the moment when Eisenhower's leadership style proved decisive. He wasn't a tactical genius like Patton. He wasn't a strategic innovator like MacArthur. But he understood human psychology and organizational behavior better than any Allied commander. He knew that armies don't fail because of bad tactics. They fail because commanders lose confidence and soldiers lose cohesion. If he could keep his commanders focused on attacking, if he could keep his soldiers believing victory was inevitable, then the Allies would grind through whatever resistance Germany could organize. June 10, 1944. The German counteroffensive everyone feared was developing. The Panzer Division had reached the front lines. The 12th SS Panzer Division was preparing to attack toward the beaches. German commanders believed they could split the Allied beachheads and defeat the invasion in detail. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of waiting to defend against the German offensive, Allied forces attacked first. The American 29th Infantry Division, still recovering from Omaha Beach casualties, pushed inland toward St. Lo. The attack was chaotic. Units got lost in the Normandy hedgerows. German resistance was fierce, but the Americans kept attacking. British forces launched an offensive toward Cannes. They didn't take the city, but they forced German panzer divisions to defend instead of attack. The offensive disrupted German timing. The counteroffensive that was supposed to hit the beaches instead got pulled into a defensive battle for Cannes. Canadian forces attacked toward Carpiquet Airfield. They took heavy casualties. They didn't capture their objectives, but they kept German forces reacting to Allied movements. This was Eisenhower's strategy made real. The Allies weren't trying to win perfect tactical victories. They were trying to seize the initiative, make the Germans respond, disrupt German planning, prevent the coordinated counteroffensive that could defeat the invasion. German commanders were confused. The intelligence assessment said Allied forces were disorganized and vulnerable. Instead, they were attacking everywhere. German forces were supposed to be counterattacking. Instead, they were defending. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in Western Europe, reported to Berlin that Allied offensive pressure was making it impossible to organize the major counteroffensive Hitler demanded. Every time German forces prepared to attack, Allied forces hit them first. This was exactly what Eisenhower had gambled on. His forces didn't need to win every engagement. They needed to prevent German forces from concentrating for a knockout blow. Aggressive attacks, even failed attacks, accomplished that objective. June 12, 1944. The Allied beachheads linked up. American forces from Utah and Omaha connected. British forces from Gold and American forces from Omaha connected. The separate beachheads became a single front. This was the moment when Eisenhower's decision to hold an attack paid off strategically. German commanders had hoped to defeat Allied forces while they were separated. Once the beachheads linked, that option disappeared. The Allies now had a continuous front that could support itself. Reinforcements were flowing into Normandy. The 2nd Armored Division landed. The 9th Infantry Division landed. British armor was coming ashore. The Allies were building combat power faster than German forces could match. The storm the meteorologists predicted hit on June 19th. It was devastating. The American Mulberry Harbor at Omaha Beach was destroyed. Ships were driven ashore. Resupply operations stopped for 3 days. This was the crisis that Eisenhower's staff had warned about. But by June 19th, Allied forces had been attacking for nearly 2 weeks. They had pushed far enough inland that German artillery couldn't reach the beaches. They had captured enough territory that supply dumps could be built in relatively secure areas. The storm was a setback, but it wasn't catastrophic. If Eisenhower had accepted his staff's recommendations to consolidate defensively after D-Day, the storm might have been decisive. Allied forces would have been pinned close to the beaches, vulnerable to German artillery, dependent on constant resupply. The storm would have cut them off at the moment they were most vulnerable. Instead, Eisenhower's order to attack had pushed Allied forces far enough inland that the storm was an inconvenience, not a disaster. The gamble had worked. If this kind of historical analysis is hitting different, if you're seeing how these decisions ripple through time, you know what to do. Subscribe. We're going deep on the moments that mattered, the choices that changed everything. Don't just watch, join the conversation. June 26, 1944. Eisenhower received a message from Winston Churchill. The Prime Minister was concerned about Allied progress in Normandy. British forces were stalled at Caen. American forces were grinding through the hedgerows with heavy casualties. The advance was slow. The casualties were mounting. Churchill's message was diplomatic, but the subtext was clear. Was Eisenhower's strategy working? Should the Allies reconsider their approach? Eisenhower's response was blunt. The strategy was working exactly as planned. The objective wasn't rapid territorial gains. The objective was destroying German combat power. Every day Allied forces attacked, German forces took casualties they couldn't replace. Every day the Allies held Normandy, more American and British divisions landed. The math was simple. The Allies could replace losses. The Germans couldn't. As long as Allied forces maintained offensive pressure, German forces would eventually collapse. This was a strategic calculation that Eisenhower had made on June 7th. He wasn't trying to win quickly. He was trying to win inevitably. The slow, grinding advance through Normandy wasn't a failure. It was a plan. German commanders were reaching the same conclusion. July 1944 assessments from Field Marshal Rommel were pessimistic. German forces were taking unsustainable casualties. Allied material superiority was overwhelming. German counterattacks were failing because Allied air power and artillery destroyed concentrations before they could attack. Rommel sent a message to Hitler that was essentially a confession of defeat. German forces couldn't stop the Allied advance. They could slow it, make it costly, but they couldn't stop it. Germany needed to seek a political settlement before Allied forces broke out of Normandy. Hitler rejected Rommel's assessment and demanded continued resistance. But the German military professionals understood what Eisenhower's decision to hold Normandy had achieved. The Allies had established an unbreakable foothold in France. Everything that followed was inevitable. July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra. American forces launched a breakout offensive from a Normandy beachhead. 7 weeks of grinding combat through hedgerows had positioned Allied forces for this moment. German defenses, weakened by constant Allied attacks, collapsed. American armor poured through the gap. Patton's Third Army raced across France. German forces retreated in chaos. The battle for Normandy was over. The race to Germany had begun. None of that would have been possible if Eisenhower had accepted the cautious advice his staff gave him on June 7th. If Allied forces had consolidated defensively, if they had waited for perfect conditions, if they had given German forces time to organize a proper counteroffensive, the invasion could have been defeated. Eisenhower's decision to attack immediately, to trade casualties for initiative, to refuse any consideration of withdrawal, had made the breakout possible. The 7 weeks of brutal fighting weren't a mistake. They were the necessary price for destroying German defensive capabilities. After the war, Allied analysts studied the Normandy campaign. They interviewed German commanders. They reviewed German assessments. The consensus was clear. German forces came closest to defeating the invasion in the first week after D-Day. If Allied forces had remained defensive, if they had focused on consolidating their beachheads instead of attacking, German forces might have organized a successful counteroffensive. Eisenhower's order to attack, issued when his own staff was quietly discussing evacuation contingencies, had prevented that counteroffensive. German forces spent the critical first week responding to Allied attacks instead of preparing their own offensive. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who commanded German armed forces, testified after the war that the speed of Allied offensive operations after D-Day surprised German commanders. They had expected the Allies to pause and reorganize. Instead, the Allies attacked immediately with forces that were still disorganized from the landing. That aggressiveness disrupted German planning and prevented the coordinated counteroffensive that might have succeeded in the invasion's first week. General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of German Armed Forces Operations Staff, stated that German commanders lost confidence in their ability to defeat the invasion by June 15th. Allied offensive pressure had been too consistent. German forces were reacting instead of acting. The strategic initiative had been permanently lost. June 15th was 8 days after Eisenhower made his decision to hold and attack. 8 days was how long it took for that decision to become irreversible strategic advantage. The lesson from Normandy wasn't about tactics or equipment or even leadership in the traditional sense. It was about organizational confidence and strategic resolve. Eisenhower won the battle for Normandy on June 7th by refusing to consider anything except victory. His commanders and his soldiers internalized that mindset. Once they believed defeat was impossible, it became impossible. German commanders after the war emphasized this point repeatedly. Allied forces in Normandy weren't technically superior. German tanks were better. German tactical doctrine was more refined. German soldiers were more experienced. But Allied forces had something German forces lacked by June 1944: absolute confidence in inevitable victory. That confidence came from the top. Eisenhower had looked at casualty reports and weather forecasts and intelligence assessments that suggested the invasion might fail, and he had decided it couldn't fail. That decision became a command. That command became organizational culture. That culture became strategic reality. The mathematics of war are brutal. In those first weeks after D-Day, Allied forces suffered approximately 73,000 casualties. That's more American, British, and Canadian boys dead or wounded than live in many small cities. Every one of those casualties had a mother receiving a telegram. Every one had a family shattered by grief. Eisenhower carried that weight. After the war, he told interviewers that the hardest part of command wasn't making tactical decisions. It was knowing that every order he gave would result in men dying. The order to hold Normandy, an attack, had killed thousands of Allied soldiers. But the alternative would have killed more. If the invasion had failed, the war would have continued for years. The Soviet Union would have bled Europe white. Millions more would have died. The world that emerged from that alternate history would have been far darker. Eisenhower understood he wasn't choosing between casualties and no casualties. He was choosing between acceptable casualties and catastrophic casualties, between losing thousands now or losing millions later. That's command. That's the burden leaders carry when the stakes are civilization itself. Before we wrap this up, if you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person we're making this content for. Someone who wants the real story, the complexity, the human decisions behind the headlines. Subscribe and be part of this community. We got more stories like this coming, and you won't want to miss them. June 6, 1945. 1 year after D-Day. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime was destroyed. Allied forces occupied Berlin. The war in Europe was over. Eisenhower stood at the American cemetery in Normandy, looking at rows of white crosses stretching toward the horizon. 9,000 American graves. British and Canadian cemeteries nearby held thousands more. These were the men who died to hold the beachhead. Reporters asked Eisenhower if the invasion could have been done better, if there was a way to avoid those casualties, if he regretted any decisions. Eisenhower's answer was simple. No, the invasion succeeded because Allied forces refused to accept failure. Every casualty was a tragedy. Every grave represented a family's grief. But those men had won the war. Their sacrifice had defeated evil. History would remember them as the generation that saved the world. The decision Eisenhower made on June 7, 1944, to hold Normandy despite early losses, to attack despite disorganization, to refuse any discussion of withdrawal, was a hinge moment of World War II's Western Front. If he had chosen differently, if he had accepted his staff's cautious advice, the entire course of the war might have changed. But Eisenhower understood something his staff didn't. Wars aren't won by avoiding risks. They're won by accepting the right risks at the right moments. Normandy in June 1944 was that moment. The risk was losing everything. The reward was winning everything. He took the risk. The Allies won everything. That's command. That's leadership. That's what it looks like when one person's decision determines whether civilization survives or falls. Eisenhower wasn't a perfect commander. He made mistakes throughout the war. But on June 7, 1944, when it mattered most, he made the right call. The world we live in today exists because Eisenhower chose to hold Normandy. Every democracy, every free election, every person living under representative government instead of totalitarian rule. It all traces back to that moment when one man looked at casualty reports and weather forecasts and intelligence assessments suggesting failure, and decided that failure simply wasn't an option. That's why we study history, not for dates and battles and statistics, but for moments like this, moments when human courage and judgment determined the future, moments when the right decision meant everything and the wrong decision meant darkness. Eisenhower made the right decision, and the light won.